All right, we'll get started up here. Thanks all for coming. Good number of our students for being for Dr. Mason. So glad we can make it out today. This is our annual Constitution Day, and with COVID last year, we didn't have as much of an opportunity to meet. We had a little display case at the library, so this time we actually did face-to-face, so thanks for coming. Before I get started, again, in case you have not done so as a student, we do have the sign-in sheets over there. You can do that afterwards. I think most of you have done that. At any rate, I do want to make a few opening remarks. As a little preface, we're not advocating secession of any kind. So, we had that in the announcement, but we're looking at it from a more academic standpoint as a question and how it relates to the Constitution. So Dr. Mason of political science, Dr. Aaron Mason, will be providing us some commentary. I may add a little bit of color commentary on the side, but we're also going to put things into kind of a larger context within American history as a whole, but also global history, current contemporary global trends. So we're going to be taking a look at the U.S. Constitution and the issue of secession. And as you're going to find out, these issues have been debated on and off probably from day one. So this is nothing new, but I think it's a timely topic. At any rate, we will get started, and I'll let Dr. Mason take the floor. And we'll save questions for the last 10, 15 minutes or so. We'll run about an hour, give or take a little. And we're more than happy also to talk with you afterwards. But Dr. Mason, now I'll do the PowerPoint for you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And we can get the office to you.
Oh, thank you. All right, now that I'm in power, I'm canceling you out and I'm taking over. I'm going to really do what all the dictators do. And without a constitution, guys, that's what we have, right? So, appreciate the comments there. Let's jump into this right away. Cell phones, if you have any cell phones, use those as well, please. Dr. Schmaltz said, really, the whole idea of secession is not new. It really has been an endemic issue with our Constitution because it's such a vague document. So,
it's very bipartisan. So we got California, mostly Democrat, Texas, still Republican.
yeah.
It's not partisan. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're ready for the next. Go ahead.
Okay. Did you see that?
Next slide.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Did you see it?
No, we're stuck on the first one here.
Oh, I see. I got to start. Never mind.
Okay.
I had it on the first slide.
It's getting whiplash here.
You see the pictures?
No, we're still on the title page. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I had several.
Anybody know the good jokes?
How many professors does it take to run a
Oh,
PowerPoint?
more than we.
Zero.
We need somebody that has skills, right?
Yeah.
You're asking professors to do this? That's the problem.
Yeah, we were experimenting with something else. Most of these were.
That's okay. We always. It wouldn't be a talk if we didn't have something here or something.
Sorry.
Anyway, just to kind of give a little background. Yeah, the idea of secession is, I think, one of the oldest issues that the founders had to deal with because the states were reluctant to place themselves under.
Is it working?
Yeah, we have President Trump chasing California out of the Union,
Democrats.
and then we have Texas
Republicans.
perennially deciding to leave the Union. Yeah,
So yeah, this is equal opportunity.
Yeah, it is funny watching, both sides, when they have power, they always say, now wait a minute, everybody needs to obey me, do what I say. But then when you're out of power, the secession argument is what you use, right, to threaten your enemies. Right? Okay, there. Perfect, thank you, sir.
Yep.
Okay, so in a broad sense, and we want to condense this, I will not do justice to the particular issues that we mentioned, nor are all the factors that we could consider contained within our PowerPoint. So we're going to have to paint this in broad strokes. But you can kind of say that there are two general theories that could be applied to the study of secession. And the first one is the emanation theory. The second is the compact theory. The emanation theory is the one that would be opposed to secession. The compact theory is the one that's probably most amenable to secession. So, okay, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So what is the emanation theory of the Constitution? Essentially, it's based upon what we call the positive law tradition, which is the notion of man-made law, if you will, human-made law. Whereas natural law typically is the idea of God-made law, or laws that transcend the human experience. The issue of positive law, how it's applied to the U.S. Constitution, is most clearly seen with Thomas Hobbes and the notion of social contract theory. In other words, human beings form government for human purposes, and the purposes for which they are created never change. So in other words, if we were talking to Thomas Hobbes, and those of y'all that have had my 11, 13 class know who he was, that he says we form governments for the purpose of what? What are we talking about in class just the other day? Joe, come on, help me out here. What's the real purpose why government's created? You know this, right? Just make sure. Okay. To do what? To protect life and liberty, right? Protect life and property, particularly life and property, but also our liberties, right? Within circumscribed bounds. And so the argument is what? Is that the reasons which compelled civil society to be formed in 1787 under the Constitution have not changed, have they? That the same concerns that people had then exist now, right? We want to protect ourselves from thieves, we want to protect ourselves from people that would steal from us, people that would harm us, right? So government is instituted for what purpose? Primarily to protect life and property, right? That does not change, Hobbes would say, because Hobbes says that human nature is immutable, it doesn't change. So the necessity of maintaining the Union today is the same as it was in 1787 because the human condition doesn't change, right? And that once you establish civil government in the form of a social contract, in our case the Constitution, that is an immutable fact, it doesn't go away. So there would be no circumstance under which you could change the social contract to the extent that secession would be possible, because you would be undermining the nature of the social contract. Right? That's essentially the argument there. And the notion is that we can still have liberty under this arrangement, but it must be ordered liberty. That anything that we do in the name of liberty has to be within the constraints of the social contract. Again, we can amend the Constitution, we can pass laws that obviate old laws, but we can't negate the Union which made this possible. Right? That's the idea. And this perspective can even be justified from the perspective of people like John Locke. John Locke, who we associate as the guy that says, well, you can do anything you want, you can have the right of revolution. That's true, but John Locke, he was the inspiration, of course, for the Declaration of Independence. But the fact is that Locke even defended what was called the prerogative of the executive, which is the right of the government to use extraordinary means to hold the government together in times of crisis. Proponents of this theory, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, John Adams, well, the highest ranking pantheon of American deities, right, of the American Revolution. So people that like to hang their hat on this and say, hey, secession's a bad deal, who's going to disagree with Alexander Hamilton? He's got a play named after him.
I was just going to add, too, these are all Federalists, too.
Yes.
But I'm going to find out Federalists have their own ideas sometimes.
Yeah, and again, they also tended to be diplomats, or they served in usually officer roles in the Revolution. And this is because they found that the coordination of the government under the Articles of Confederation was very problematic. So they needed a stronger government to prosecute the war, conduct foreign policy. So their experience of the Revolution led them to believe that you had to have a government that was indissoluble. All right? And of course, this is the reason that Lincoln will use in the Civil War. The compact theory, we want to give equal weight here to each side, even though I'm on one side clearly, but just for the sake of discussion, because there are two sides to this. The compact theory of the Constitution, an agreement among consenting states. This is supported more by the natural rights perspective on law. And of course, natural rights, by their definition, are vague. Right? When we say, well, I have a natural right to something, there may be something to that. But if I can take that in any direction I want. In fact, natural law can be embraced by anyone because it's so malleable. It sounds more subjective. And a good statement on this is from what's known as the Virginia Declaration of Rights by, of course, I bring George Mason. I'm not related. I wish I was related to George Mason. I'm not. I know I'm not. So We just happen to share the same last name. But George Mason is one of the more important underrepresented founding fathers. But George Mason wrote what was known as the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was incorporated into the Virginia State Constitution, and it's still there, by the way. This is still part of their state constitution, but it says, all men are by nature equally free, independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact, this is so important, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty. So he's saying that if my father signs into a social compact, that's fine for him. And its terms are binding on him as long as he wants, but they're not binding on me. Notice that. You can't even deprive your children, right, your posterity, of the right to renegotiate the social contract. So this is the so-called Jeffersonian compact theory. And they typically feared that a central government with too much power would coerce the states into becoming detrimental to the liberty of the people. And if you want a further commentary on this, you need only read Federalist Paper 46, because Madison explains this, in which he basically outlines the idea that the states will be armed. The states will not only, under the Constitution, have National Guard units, essentially, the state militias, to protect them from the national government, but the individual citizens themselves will be armed, largely for the purpose of protecting them from encroaches against the federal government. So you can argue, well, if people don't have a right to secession, why wouldn't they have the right to be armed? That's the argument that would be given here. Okay, next slide. So what are some arguments against secession? Number one, the notion of the permanent union of states. If you go back and look at the Articles of Confederation, which of course was the government that immediately preceded the Constitution, right? The actual title of the Articles of Confederation, we oftentimes say that that's the entire name. That's not actually it. The entire name contained the phrase, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. That was the actual title. So you can argue that the predecessor to the Constitution was a document, while it didn't give a lot of power to the central government, it was intended to be a permanent union of states. In fact, Hamilton uses this phrase in Federalist 6 to talk about the morbid language that he talks about, the dangers of disunion that would lead us into the same types of problems that they had in Europe, with just wars that never end between factions. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is a statement on insurrection. This is found in Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which provides Congress the authority to call forth the militia to, quote, suppress insurrections. Well, by that very logic, if the states have the power to act as autonomous republics, they should have the power to engage in what? Insurrections against the federal government. But since they don't have that power, since Congress has delegated that authority to suppress insurrections, how can the states engage in insurrections, right? So clearly the federal government, they would argue from this perspective, was to be in charge. Okay. Limits on sovereignty. Article 1 divests or takes away from the states the right to do things that sovereign states do, like negotiate treaties with foreign governments. Congress cannot grant titles of nobility, neither can the states. So the argument goes something like this, that since the states can't engage in treaties or compacts without the consent of Congress, they lack the power of a sovereign government. If they lack the power of a sovereign government, they're not free to secede from the Union. They are constituent states of the Union. Number 4, the issue of state subdivision. Now this one is peripheral in some people's minds to secession, but I think it's important. This is the notion that the question, can a state divide itself, an existing state, can it subdivide itself into a new state? Does the state have that authority? Well, the Constitution circumscribes that power significantly with this phrase. This is known as the State Subdivision Clause, also the Admission Clause, which says that states are not free to subdivide themselves. States, when they are states of the Union, only have the power to do that with the consent of their legislature and of the Congress. So simply put, states don't have the authority to subdivide themselves on their own authority. If they were truly sovereign, they would have that power, right? And technically speaking, as this is defined, we've only had one state do that. That, of course, was West Virginia, and that, of course, occurred during the Civil War, when the Lincoln administration was so anxious to get any bit of Confederate territory back into the Union, they were willing to even kind of play loose and fast with how this works. We don't have time to go into all the discussion, By the way, am I saying West Virginia is illegitimate? No, I'm not saying that. But they were created under some really odd circumstances, and I think you have to take that into consideration. Okay, so if a state can't subdivide itself, what can it do?
I just want to play, this is from a couple of years ago, this is the LA Times graphic, so it's kind of an interesting regional composite. They can't, how serious are these folks? They're just saying that, or anyway, 1 in 4.
Yeah, that's quite a few people.
Yeah, and that goes all the different regions.
Right.
Roughly between 25-30%. Okay, back to you.
Thank you.
Here's the subsets here.
Oh,
I remember when I lived in Nebraska, by the way, there was a movement in western Nebraska in the 1980s. For the Panhandle, they were requesting to join Colorado. And the western Panhandle of, it's kind of like with Oklahoma, way over on the other side of the state. Lincoln, named after Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln, Nebraska was the capital, the very southeasternmost part of the state. That didn't pan out, but they did try to join Colorado, so they actually show you, some of these oddball kind of arrangements if some folks had their way.
yeah, so hold on just a second. So that's a good, I'm glad you mentioned that. So if that were to happen if the Panhandle of Nebraska wanted to secede from Nebraska, not the United
Stay
States,
right here.
they could do that, but they'd have to have the permission of the legislature in Wyoming and Nebraska and the Congress.
That's right.
So again, this could be done, but not unilaterally by the state. So it sort of undermines the state's arguments that there's terms on. Yeah, good point. Okay.
I guess they'd become Colorado football fans otherwise, right? Betray last year's.
That's a whole other thing.
It's a whole
Secession from the
story,
Big
yes.
12.
It's all ties in somehow.
Right.
Okay.
And these are, I'm glad Dr. Schmaltz has a great map because that makes the point here. We've had these recent efforts at state subdivision. So in 1992, we had the state of West Kansas, it was going to be called, and the Oklahoma Panhandle. Real quickly, why would states want to subdivide? Various reasons, but primarily the notion that the portion of the state which wishes to secede from its own state believes that its interests are not with the current borders of the state. So people in the Panhandle, and I say this with all due respect, I can understand why they feel that way. They're so geographically distant from Oklahoma City. That's the argument. They argue that they're not being well represented, perhaps. That's the argument. You can see why that is just from geography.
And then also different time zone. I know western
Time
Nebraska
zones?
plus flat trade with Colorado. So
Right.
in that case.
But the irony is that the people that want to separate are usually the ones that have the least political power, right? So it won't happen. The legislature, the numbers favor where the legislature is located. Usually that's the part of the state that says, no, you're not going anywhere, right? And you've had this with Arizona, too. There's been a north-south split in Arizona for many years. Northern Arizona is usually the part that says we'd like to leave from southern Arizona, but the legislature is in the south. The population base is in the south, so it's not likely to happen. But you had these other examples. California, state of Jefferson, that was some parts of Oregon, I think we're talking about seceding, western Maryland from eastern Maryland. And so it goes on and on. These are only a handful that you can look at.
I was going to add one thing. I mentioned Dr. Mason last week. There was a state legislator in, was it New Hampshire?
Oh, yeah.
We've been put about a ballot for the legislature to vote on seceding from the Union. Well, New Hampshire, New England. I doubt it's going to take off, but that was just last week. Perfect timing.
Okay. Relevant court cases, too, we can point to that argue against secession. Texas versus White, this is probably the most definitive one. In 1869, as if we needed a Supreme Court case to determine this, but Americans are litigious people, right? That means we're always in court, we're always threatening to sue each other. So as if the Civil War itself was not sufficient means by which to determine is secession constitutional. We had to have a court case on it. And there are some reasons why this case came before the Supreme Court, but Judge Salmon Chase, who was appointed by President Lincoln, he was, Chase had been Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury at one time, and Lincoln put him on the court to eliminate him as a rival for the 1864 presidential election, basically. Lincoln was such a good strategist. That was one of the reasons why he was put on there. But anyway, Judge Chase did provide invaluable work for the Lincoln administration, even in Lincoln's death, because he continued to promote this idea that secession was unconstitutional. And in this case, Judge Chase declared that secession was not constitutional in the manner in which the Confederates attempted it. In fact, he went so far as to say in the case that secession was only possible through two means, the first of which was violent military overthrow of the government. So if you lose the war, you don't get to leave. The second one was the idea that potentially secession would be possible, but not unilateral secession. The Congress would have to permit anything like that. But even then, it would be questionable. So the point being, the case stated clearly that secession was not constitutional. Another interesting one that came up was the state of Cullis versus Alaska. And this was, again, at the state level. It was not U.S. Supreme Court. But long story short, there is an active, it's called the Alaskan Independence Party. And if you ever spend any time in Alaska, you'll hear about this. Anybody here from Alaska? Their symbol, this is an actual state political party. And they advocate the peaceful removal of Alaska from the United States. And so they're not a terrorist group or anything like that. But they advocate for the peaceful partitioning away of the United States, founded in 1984. And this party constantly likes to put things on the ballot, like before the voters, would you like to secede from the Union? Just trying to kind of get the idea out there. And they did actually qualify for a number, I think it was in the 04, forgive me if I'm wrong with some of these details, I think it was for the 04 presidential election. They wanted to put on the ballot the question of secession for the people of Alaska. Just let them vote on it. Knowing that it would be non-binding, that it wouldn't have any bearing on public policy. They qualified for the number of signatures. And the Secretary of State of Alaska refused to put it on the ballot, even though they were in compliance with state laws. And the Secretary of State's argument went something like this. Well, yeah, you guys qualified, but everybody knows this is a joke, and it can't go anywhere, so there's no point wasting our time. And so they said, wait a minute, no, time out. We're in accordance with state law. Don't talk to us as though we're children. This is a very fair argument that they have. They said the people have a right to vote on this. So went before the Supreme Court of Alaska, and the Alaskan Supreme Court said, they sided with the state and said there was no point in pursuing this, that it was a question that even though they followed the rule of law, that it was not something that people should vote on. So this is kind of angers the people who support secession. They say we're being suppressed. Even when we follow the law, you guys aren't listening to us. So, but the point being that the state of Alaska said, no, you can't do this. I can understand the arguments on the other side, though. The age-old question, does the earth belong to the living or the dead? Well, this is something we could go on and on. And we do go on and on in my common law class about this. But this question that goes back to George Mason's comment about can the decisions of one generation link subsequent generations? Right? So is the Constitution binding on people who never formally gave their consent? That's the argument. Because the argument is, why is the Constitution binding on us? Well, the people who ratified it, they got to vote through state ratifying conventions. The secessionist people will say, no, that doesn't count. We didn't give our consent. Right? Well, there's an argument to be had there, but this is nothing new because this is applicable in many elements of American politics. And an example of this is the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And in 1819, the Supreme Court took this up in a case, and they basically argued that, yes, the decisions of the dead can be binding on the living, even when the dead people, they're all gone, there's no one else to enforce a social contract. The dead can be bound to the living through time and space and all these things. And this dealt with the attempts of the state of New Hampshire to take the private college of Dartmouth College and turn it into a public university. And Dartmouth refused this. They said, no, we're a private college. We want to remain private because we have a charter that predates the Constitution. In fact, their charter was signed by King George III. And ultimately, the state agreed that even though there had been a political revolution that changed the ownership of the country from the British to the United States, that some things are held inviolate. You cannot change them. And so as a result, the living could not change the social contract that the dead had established. So that's the argument that people who are opposed to secession can make. I think it's a fair argument. Okay, next slide. Post-Civil War constitutional features, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. I think it's very hard to argue for secession today versus what you had in those days. You can make a better argument prior to the Civil War amendments. But simply put, and we don't have time to go through all this, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments simply chip away at some of the sovereignty that the states had prior to the Civil War, which you might make a better argument for secession in 1861 than you can in 1868. Or 1870 by the time these amendments are passed. And just one thing we could look at is the definition of citizenship. The 14th Amendment defines what citizenship is. Prior to the 14th Amendment, there was no definitive statement on citizenship in the Constitution. there was no statement that said this is what a U.S. citizen is. That's not until the 14th Amendment, which declares that people born in the United States are citizens. That simply didn't exist prior to this. Your citizenship prior to the 14th Amendment was based upon what? Did your state say you were a citizen? The states got to define who were citizens. The 14th Amendment comes along and changes that. And very quickly, one of the arguments that Robert E. Lee made as to why he seceded, why he resigned from the U.S. Army and participated in the Civil War against the Union, was he argued that, well, my citizenship, according to the federal Constitution, is based, think about this, it's based on the U.S. Constitution, right, which is silent on the issue. So how do I know I'm a U.S. citizen? Well, I'm a citizen of the United States because I'm a citizen of Virginia, right? And that's true. That was how citizenship was generally defined at that time. Post that, we have the 1868 14th Amendment that says, no, because you're born in the United States, that makes you a citizen. It didn't exist yet. So he argued that when Virginia seceded from the Union, he no longer had U.S. citizenship. So he had to follow Virginia, and he had to fight for Virginia. Now, you can accept that argument, not accept that argument, but that was his public statement, essentially, as to why he became a Confederate, if you want to use that word. But he probably wouldn't be comfortable with that term. He was simply saying, I was following the state, which I was required to follow. All right, that was his argument. Pro-secession arguments. All right, how can we argue for this? Again, I'm not arguing for this. I'm just trying to be to present the other side. You can argue this. You can say it is not a delegated power to the national government, so it's retained by the states. Are there things that the states get to do in the Constitution that are not mentioned? Yeah, there's a lot of them. That's why we have the 10th Amendment, right? So the founders, they would say, well, the founders simply refused to place this in the Constitution because they were leaving it in the hands of the states. Okay, that's the first one. Next one. The U.S. government was created as a result of a secession movement within the British Empire. This is more of a dicey proposition, I would argue, but you can argue this if you wish. You could say that America was essentially a secession movement. Now, I would argue that the American Revolution was more of a revolution and not a secession. You say, well, what's the distinction? Well, a revolution implies the notion that you're fundamentally changing society. And the U.S. Constitution and the way it governs is functionally different than the political approaches that the British had. Things like separation of church and state, the abolition of monarchy, the establishment of a true republic. That was not Great Britain. That was not the American colonies in 1776. We had all those things. We had a state church under the Church of England. We had a monarch. We were not a republic. We were a constitutional monarchy. So the idea that the American Revolution is a true secession movement, no, it's more of a revolution. Secession implies that we're just going to remove ourselves and remain functionally the same. So I'm trying to undermine that argument, I suppose. But that's the argument they'll make. They'll say, no, we're just doing what the founding fathers did. If you support secession. All right, next one. This one is way too technical to get into here, but I've thrown it out here just for your interest, if you're interested in it. People who support secession will say something like a proper view of American political theory avoids any serious centralization of federal authority. And if you follow what's known as the Austrian School of Economics, which is an example of this is a devotee of a guy named Thomas de Lorenzo, who provides lots of critiques of Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln. They would simply say that everything we've done since the Civil War centralizes authority. It moves us away from the ideas that Jefferson had and some of our founding fathers, and say that basically Hamilton turned his back on what it meant to be a true revolutionary. The Austrian School of Economics, which is kind of a libertarian approach to one way of describing it, rejects any type of centralization of authority, which would preclude the possibility of secession. So simply saying, if you're really interested in this, you can read Thomas de Lorenzo and his critiques under the Austrian School of Economics. If you ever want a really interesting, and I think people should have the right to read, think for themselves, go and Google Thomas de Lorenzo. A lot of his talks are on YouTube, and he's just a very visceral. He's very visceral in his hatred of Abraham Lincoln. Calls Lincoln a war criminal. Says Lincoln caused the Civil War. Lincoln was part of a Republican plot to introduce to America, essentially. that the Civil War was avoidable, the Republicans caused it, and they were trying to fundamentally transform the country. I'll let you decide. But his arguments would be much more in line with the idea that secession is possible. It's just that we've changed how we see the Constitution as a result of this conspiracy. The simple notion of self-determination and the sovereignty of the people. That's a simple thing to say, but it's very powerful. Simple. If people choose to change the political arrangement that they have, they're free to do that because they're free agents under natural law. Again, going back to the arguments that George Mason promoted, people are free to do this. If they think putting the Declaration of Independence, the government becomes destructive for the purposes for which it was created, it's the right of people to overthrow it. It is a new government. So. Examples of historic precedents and the words of the founders. Very quickly here, so we'll talk about a class in our 11-13 class soon. You can find precedents and the words of the founders who seem to lend themselves toward the idea of secession, or at least undermining the federal government. A great example of this, or we're known collectively, is the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were laws passed by the Congress that were very unpopular, particularly in states dominated by the Jeffersonians. And to make a long story short, in response to what were known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison introduced counter resolutions into the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky. What did these resolutions say? These resolutions quite simply said that states had the authority, state legislatures had the authority to determine what was constitutional in their state, not the Supreme Court. That comes later. That is very true because the Constitution does not explicitly grant the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, the right of judicial review. If the courts don't have that right 100% constitutionally speaking, somebody else has to have that right. Well, they argue, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Okay, these are not two guys that are just, I would say they're not just two hicks hanging on a parking meter downtown, leaning there, sitting at the Cracker Barrel, discussing Cracker Barrel philosophy. They're not just hanging around. These are pretty important heavyweights, right? This is James Madison, the guy who's the author. He's considered the father of the Constitution. And Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, are telling us that states have the right to determine what's constitutional. And if they have that right, they have the right to nullify acts of the federal government. Which means what? Congress could pass a law and they could declare in Kentucky that it has no legal force. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that today. That'd be like the state of Oklahoma saying on April 16th, you don't have to pay your taxes to the federal government. You can just forget that. By the way, they're not saying that. That's not going to happen, okay? But that's not going to happen because we don't interpret the Constitution this way. But Madison did, all right? So if James Madison is telling us we could nullify acts of the federal government, that's something we have to take into consideration when we look at things, right? Another thing, real quickly, that's interesting here is what's called the Hartford Convention. This was done in the fall of 1814 when the War of 1812 was going very badly for the United States. And a group of New England states, a group of delegates from New England states met in a public convention in Hartford, Connecticut, and they were discussing the progress of the war, but one of the things they discussed was the potential for secession. Now think about this. This is not the quintessential example of, when you think of secession, you think of that always coming from the South, right? These are New England states. They're threatening to secede from the Union because they believe that the war is going to end badly. And so they're talking about seceding from the Union, declaring themselves an independent country, calling themselves something like the United States of New England, and then sue for a separate peace with the British and hopefully escape with their hides, right? And then let the British turn their wrath on the rest of the country. Well, fortunately, the war, and Dr. Schmaltz is much better explained this than I am, with the things going on in Europe at that time, right? Because the War of 1812 was tied to events on the continent. Fortunately, the war ends up concluding itself as a truce, and so nothing happens as a result of this. But New England states were considering seceding from the Union. So people today who support secession say, well, we could look at that. We've got Madison saying that the states can nullify acts of the federal government, and we have federalists. We have people in New England arguing the right to secede from the country. By the way, there's one of the great ironies of history. Who was the president in 1814? Give me the answer in a couple of seconds. Who was president during the War of 1812? Yes, but yeah, Madison, James Madison, right? So now here's the irony. Madison authors one of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions saying the states can nullify acts of the federal government, right, in 1798. But then 16 years later, he finds himself as the chief executive saying, wait a minute, time out, I'm the president. Y'all aren't supposed to be talking about seceding while I'm president, right? So what comes around, it's almost like he posted something on Twitter, and then he got in trouble for it later, right? And this was brought to his attention on more than one occasion. He got, well, what are you going to do?
They called it Mr. Madison's War.
Yeah, Mr. Madison.
And by the way, this destroyed the Federalist Party. This was a party of Washington and Franklin.
Yeah.
It was after 1814 it kind of disintegrated. The ideas remained, became the future Whigs and the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's exactly
This
right.
was the death knell, so.
Yeah, this was a chain on their neck they couldn't get off. So, okay, very good. Very good. Next one.
I think that kind of summarizes kind of Dr. Mason's. I just want to kind of provide a little global context, and feel free also to add Dr. Mason too. We won't spend too much time. But again, we tend to look at American history kind of simply as Americans, but we forget there are larger developments. We're part of a larger history. We're both influencing and being influenced. There's some cross-pollination or maybe parallel developments, not always directly, but sometimes directly. We're such a big country, it's easy to forget there's something outside of the United States. So these are just some of the independence movements we've had in North, South America, in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, you can see the Confederacy too from the Civil War, of course, Texas. I know a number of Canadians. Anybody outside of Quebec, they tend not to like the French-speaking Quebecois. There is an effort, and I think even within the Canadian federal system, the provinces can technically leave. It's still a minority, but it's growing in the prairie provinces of Canada, like Saskatchewan, Alberta. I run into some Canadians at international conferences who talk about that. They're actually in favor of it. Again, I'm not endorsing it. Also British Columbia. You mentioned Alaska, Dr. Mason. We got some folks on the West Coast, New England. Quebec, the French-speaking part of Canada. Remember, French is one of the two primary languages, official languages, since the 1960s. They've had a secession movement, but they've remained within Canada because it's still in their interest to do so economically, culturally. They are kind of protected. It goes back to the British Empire, actually. However, there are also, as you know, Dr. Mason, the First Nations, the indigenous peoples, they're asking how come the Quebec French speakers get concessions, how come they don't? So you have different movements among different tribes. We've talked about earlier before Dr. Mason about the federal Indian tribes too. If you didn't have a central authority, these old rivalries would come into play. You wouldn't have a referee to keep an eye on them. So same thing in Canada. If you had central authority breakdown, you might have all the different groups going at it. You have a number of movements in South America I won't get into, but also Brazil, places like that. I just want to mention, since I'm actually a Soviet history person, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. I've been to Ukraine. My family's used to live in the Soviet Union, my extended family. Russia is kind of the mirror image of the United States. We're not the same, but we have a lot of parallels. A northern hemispheric power, huge territory, lots of different ethnic groups, both native and immigrant colonists and others who were absorbed into this huge land-based empire. They extended all the way to Alaska and Oregon country at one point. In my lifetime, Dr. Mason's lifetime, maybe in a couple of other people's lifetimes, we old-timers, we lived through history in the 1990s with the fall of communism. The Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, was the last multinational empire in a strict traditional sense. It collapsed in 1991. And these are the different republics that broke off. Russia is the largest of them. Did you notice all these other little countries like Ukraine, the Baltic states, White Russia, then you have the Central Asian states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and some of the Caucasus states like Armenia. 15 constituent republics came out of that. And Russia went from a country of 270 million to about 140 million overnight almost. And this just shows you on the right the number of different groups there in Russia, the Russian Federation today, which is the largest of the states. Russia technically is a federal system. It's technically, officially, a multinational state. They do grant degrees of self-determination, like with our native tribes, with different nationalities. But ultimately, the Russians dominate. They're about half the population, only half, but they're still the dominant group. But that happened in our lifetime. And this was a shock. Nobody expected this. And this is a great book. It came out in 1992. It was written by an economist and writer, Daryl Delamidy. I read this as an undergraduate, And then I did a book review on it, graduate school, still have it. New super regions of Europe. This is right after the Cold War, in the early 90s. And that's the beginnings of the attempts to have the European Union to reunify Europe, to have a free and, I guess you'd say, interdependent free trade zone of Europe, the United States of Europe. But he was interesting in the sense that he's looking at the immediate post-Cold War period, unification of Germany. But he's also looking back in history, and despite the attempts to unite Europe, you still have all these little nation states. You've got ethnic groups within nation states. These differences go back centuries. You have a long history of independence, cultural differences. But he's putting this into a larger context. We're seeing the growth of ethnic nationalism and tribal consciousness in the era of globalization. It's a paradox. They're feeding off of each other. So the more you attempt to unify things, the more potential there is to fragmentate. It's kind of ironic, kind of paradoxical. It's a great book. And those who know, I don't know if I mentioned in my European history classes, but Europe is currently in its third longest period of relative peace in its 2,000 plus year history. The first period was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, from Caesar Augustus up until Marcus Aurelius, about 200 years. Relative peace, 200 years. That's from about the first century, beginning of the first century AD until about 180. The second longest is from the Napoleonic Wars conclusion of 1815 until World War I, 1914. It's 99 years. We're the third longest, the Pax Americana, the American peace, since 1945. We have another, 1945 to 2021, that is 76 years. We've got 24 years to beat the second longest record. But that's something to think about. That's not very good odds. And again, I could be wrong, but Europe is constantly, throughout its history, going back to Rome, repeatedly, this effort to bring things back together. So we'll see where things go. But it's a fascinating book. I really recommend it. Today, this is Europe, in the era of the European Union. Very small area, you can fit most of it within the United States. Lots of different ethnic groups, especially the farther east you go. But even in the western parts, look at, you get different separatist autonomy movements going back for centuries. I think of Scotland, Wales. These were the first colonies of England, right? Ireland, Northern Ireland today. Parts of Spain, parts of France, Belgium, northern versus southern Italy. We have the Russians moving into Crimea and Ukraine. We've got other little separatist movements in the former Yugoslavia. We have genocide, civil war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Relative peace, but again, you have local genocide. The Middle East, I won't even get into, right? All the artificial boundaries there and all the different ethnic groups and religions and other differences. But in any case, it's all kind of smushed together, as you can see there. This is Brussels, right? One of the capitals of the European Union. In Belgium. Flanders is the German-speaking part. It's the industrial north versus and also more Protestant. The southern part is more Catholic and more rural. And they're known as the Walloons in the south, the Catholic French speakers, and the Germanic-speaking folks are the Flemish. And so they've had an autonomy movement on both sides there as well. So ironically, the European capital's caught there in the middle. Again, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Northern Italy versus Southern Italy, Spain. We've got some potential issues there. But again, I don't think it's going to happen per se, but under the surface, you can kind of paper over, there's still more linguistic, religious, and other cultural differences. Northern Italy is much like what the American North used to be to the old American South. The north of Italy is a mixed population of ethnic German, Italian, more industrialized, more urban, wealthier. Southern Italy is more agrarian, right, and less prosperous. And a lot of Northerners want to break away. But that's been going on for generations. Africa and the Middle East, again, we partly thank the European powers for creating a lot of contested boundaries. Again, a multi-ethnic, multi-tribal region. Long history going back to the occupation of Africa with the various European empires. This just shows you in a nutshell some of the contested areas there today. We've had 2 new countries added since 1991, right? South Sudan. And that may have been a legitimate case, mostly Christian part of Sudan that broke off from the Islamic northern half. And then we have Eritrea here near Somalia. So we've had some newcomers to the United Nations as a result. Failed or feeble states, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq. Oh, and Afghanistan was under foreign occupation, but as of a few weeks ago, it's under the Taliban. And Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires. So again, a lot of history, tribal, ethnic differences, contested boundaries, just to put that in a nutshell. So this is not unique just to North America. Philippine Islands, we actually have U.S. troops still stationed there. We don't know about it, right? You don't hear about it? There's an Islamic separatist group, different ethnic group from the primarily Roman Catholic Filipinos. They're in the north. We were fighting these guys under General Pershing 120 years ago when we took over the Philippines in 1898. But again, you have ethnic and religious differences here as well, just in the Philippines. China, mainland communist China, they got a little island of Taiwan. China has 39 officially recognized ethnic groups. It's the Mandarin and Han Chinese who are dominant, but you have groups like the Cantonese, you've got the coastal cities, they're very cosmopolitan. Tibet's being culturally repressed, being absorbed into mainland China. Remember, it lost its independence in 1950. And then we have the primarily Islamic, Central Asian peoples, the Uyghurs, right? Technically, you think there may be genocide going on there. A mineral-rich, resource-rich land, but with a population that has separatist tendencies, and they're facing the brunt of it. You've got Mongolia, Hong Kong, that's another story. But anyway, China has a long fear of breaking up. They have a long history of that, so they're not a monolith either. So this is not just unique, to any one of these areas. This is kind of a global thing if you look closely enough. And with that, I will say thank you. We'll open up for any questions or comments. I'll hand over the mic if anybody wants to come up. Dr. Mason, did you want to add anything?
No, I can't beat that.
How's your disc jockey for audience and the cameraman?
It's fine.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, here, let me play the sound man here. So that the recording will get that. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, please.
Just a question regarding states who seriously consider secession. Just the logistics issue, as far as a couple of things that came to mind immediately was like FDIC assurances and emergency funding. Even a state the size of Texas was applying for emergency fund paperwork 2 weeks before the last hurricane. And that would also inhibit, military assistance, National Guard assistance, and all of that if they seceded. How do they, did they go that far, or they just say, we're mad and we want to leave?
I'll go a step further than that, which is related to, so FDIC, well, are they going to use U.S. dollars? What's the value of that U.S. dollar? Is the U.S. dollar a negotiable currency in the new country that they declared? Right. You're exactly.
As a citizen, I would be very skeptical.
Very skeptical, yeah. And so that's just one of however many possible problems with this. The financial situation. How are you going to determine what currency to use and what's the value of it? Absolutely. And it's funny because some of these governors they talk about. Governor Perry did this. He talked about, well, we're going to secede from the Union. Well, he was also running for president, I believe, at that time. So he's going to be president of the United States and secede from the Union. That works. So with all due respect to anybody that promotes it, I think those are legitimate questions.
There's always the law of unintended consequences, economically, politically. Or if you succeed, then there might be groups within your country that want to secede from that and break down to the local level.
I think that's exactly, when Adams talks about the notion of order of liberty, what's to stop a city from seceding, a county from the state, a city from the county, a block from the city, and a citizen's home from the block, right? This is the issue of ordered liberty, that you can have liberty, but you cannot have liberty of the individual that is so great that it obviates the rights of people around. And that would clearly violate the rights. If I'm the only person on my block that doesn't want to secede from the city, well, that's going to kind of drag me with them, right? And so, and again, if the individual, the autonomous individual, which is kind of the heart of secession, if their rights aren't protected, then what gives everybody else the right to secede from the state, right? It reminds me of the great quote. There was an editorial in I think it was the Charleston Mercury. It was one of the newspapers that was extant at the time of the South Carolinian secession from the Union in December of 1860. And it was an editorial printed there that said South Carolina, it was the only editorial that voted against, that supported maintaining the Union and not separating from the Union. It said that South Carolina was too small to be an independent republic, but it was also too large to serve as an insane asylum. All right, so this is crazy, right? What are we doing? But yeah, your point is well taken. Other questions? Joe, go ahead.
So that
Here, let's get, could you use the mic, Joe?
Yeah.
Thank you. Try to record it so we can hear either way. Okay. Oh, thanks. Tandy, if you don't mind, just hold it.
on the screen there, are some of those states going into Mexico?
There is a movement.
Sonora, yeah.
California, Arizona, Baja, California.
Yes, if you'd explain that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Start losing track after a while. I think there was one movement, that included if you have California break up into more than one part, there might be a southern part that would join. There might be Hispanic populations, although American Hispanics, they're not a monolith either. A lot of South Texan Hispanics, they don't identify with that. But there are some groups that would come about that you would have attempts to have. Because remember, northern Mexico is really Mexico's a failed state. The core of Mexico is around Mexico City. The northern part's a very different part of the country. So you could have regional breakoffs too. We have secession movement in the south of Mexico, right? The Yucatan.
Yeah,
Indian tribes. So, but in the north too, they might identify, hey, we'd rather be with California than with the core of Mexico. So you might have some crossover. But again, that's one group among others. Yeah. It's kind of complicated.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Let me bring it to you. Yeah. Need a more efficient way to do this, but just the best we can do. Right.
So when you're talking about secession, you're really talking about, that's really a symptom, it's not the cause. And you address the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which I think was really profound, essentially. We addressed it in the U.S. Constitution. We had these concerns. Any thoughts about that? I mean, you hear about the Electoral College, maybe proportional representation, because people don't feel like they're being represented. So you talk about this, but what are
What are the causes
to
that's driving it?
And then what are the answers to that if we're hearing this? Like from Alaska, Alaska wants to secede from the U.S., but your example with Nebraska, they just want to go to the next state. So.
Yeah, different reasons, and that's a profound question. Also, the case of these countries outside of the U.S. Every case study will be a bit different. It could be economic, or it might be more cultural in other cases, or ethnic or religious. But I think in many cases we like to kind of complain out loud. That's Texas or California or Alaska.
I think it's a fair
Usually
point.
it's economic, political, some kind of disconnect with the Beltway.
I appreciate
That's
the
a great
question
question.
because don't correct me if I'm misreading you, but yeah, in other words, can the motivations for this be legitimate? Are there legitimate groups? Certainly. Can the government be out of touch with its citizens? Absolutely. Can the government do things that are so, to the citizens, so outrageous that it might require this thing to shake? Yeah, I can understand that. It's not illegitimate to tell the government to live within its bounds. It's not illegitimate for the government to provide the basic protections that citizens are afforded, that they should be afforded. So yeah, I think it's fair to not demonize people. And in fact, I hope I made that point with the Alaskan independence movement. They're not a violent group. They're not advocating any violence. And I think they make a good point when they say, hey, why are we being suppressed here? We followed state law. We did what the state of Alaska requires to put a petition on the ballot, and now we have elites who are telling us we can't do it. I think it was a bad idea for them to do that. That vote could have gone forward and then been determined to be, non-binding, but the people could have at least had their say, right? That's a fair.
I would say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Get it out there, strike it down, let them make their argument, have the counter argument. Usually,
Yeah.
the right side will win the day. But there are legitimate grievances, and you hope there are enough, safety valves where you kind of at least have people who can vocalize some of their grievances. You have the petitions. Of course, we have other things we can do, whereby you kind of diffuse some of that. pressure cooker. That's what happened in a lot of these multinational empires like the Soviet Union. You kind of contain things, you contain things, you don't allow for dissidents to speak up, you repress it, you silence it, you cancel it, and then all of a sudden you get something that maybe shakes the foundations of the central regime, and all of a sudden you have a pressure cooker explosion, and that leads to bloodshed and violence. That's an extreme case, we're not at that point. But you want to have a safety valve, whether it's petitions or grievances, air it out there, strike it down civilly,
And I would argue,
you know.
when we follow our Constitution, which provides for federalism, and provides the states with real options to oppose things the federal government does, it does create a buffer to protect us from excessive power of the federal government, which no question can exist. Whether you're on the right or the left, you can argue that. And that's why I think our Constitution does the best job, I think, of striking that balance. Any other questions? One other thing that the problem with secession, that kind of go along with some of what you said there, the secessionists always like to say that they're speaking for the people, but it's not that simple. So for example, if a state were to secede from the Union, well, what about the status of Indian tribes? Well, the states don't have any control over that. That's a federal matter, in addition to the sovereignty of the Indian nation involved. So I thought it was interesting when people in California were talking about seceding when President Trump was in office. Well, wait a minute, do you speak for the federally recognized tribes of California? Do you speak for the public lands that are in California owned by the federal government, like the Redwoods, the Sequoia National Monument? No, you don't. Those aren't owned by the state of California. So the point being, there are properties, there are resources, there are people that the state of California or the state of Oklahoma or the state of whatever cannot speak for. Just because it's within your boundaries does not mean that you have control over it. So, and this goes way back to the development of federalism, where we have this dual federalism that's built into again, it goes back to our Constitution. We have power share, and that's a good thing. We want to have multiple sovereigns. We don't want one entity to speak for all.
That reminds me, Dr. Mason, the one political science class I was able to take my survey. My professor made a profound point on that issue. Federalism, always think of it as a layered cake. It's partly true. You have the national government, state governments, local. But it's really a mixed swirl cake. Like you said, it's kind of a mixed system, a lot of overlap. And it makes it harder to disengage. It's not really always hierarchical. Like you said, you have federal properties on state. And within states, you've got different jurisdictions overlapping. Sometimes they're separate. It's so complicated. It's like a swirl cake. They're sort of connected. That's something that always stuck with me. And in any case, as I get older, I tend to appreciate that more. But I just want to mention that.
Anything else, guys? Yes, sir, Jim. Yeah, go ahead. I'm not in a hurry, by the way. I love having the questions.
Yeah, we know some students have classes that too. We'll try to get you out here.
If you need to go for classes, that's fine. Thank you. We'll have more instructions on the extra credit part. Make sure you're signed up. Thanks. Thank y'all for coming. Please go ahead.
I was just going to ask how this all applies to the territories that's under the United States that aren't states.
Federal territories. Hey, you would ask a good question. I guess this is prepared for that. Well, federal territories, of course, are governed under, constitutionally speaking, under Article 1, which gives, that's a great point, which gives Congress authority to make all rules for these. Now, and each territory is a little bit different. Like Puerto Rico's governing is a little bit different than some of the others by virtue of its history and things like that. But short answer, they're pretty much at the mercy of the federal government. I don't like to use that term. The federal government contains the authority for dispensation over those territories. Is probably a better way of saying it that way. Although, like with Puerto Rico, they have essentially what we would call a plebiscite about, I think it's every 5 years.
And a Commonwealth status, so
Yeah.
they can come up.
And they vote, they have three options, basically independence, statehood, or Commonwealth status. And they have repeatedly in the last, just voted pretty solidly for Commonwealth status.
It's in their interest, probably, at least the majority. They kind of like that status, yeah. within the system.
It's a great question. Could a territory secede? Yeah, under the doctrine that Judge Chase put out in the Texas versus White case, if they could overthrow the government. But
And we've also done legally, like in the case of the Philippines, we took them over in 1898 from the Spanish in 1946. After they helped us kick out the Japanese, we provided that legally.
yeah,
So Filipino independence in 1946.
It's a great
We still have
question.
close ties with them too, but they are separate.
and that question begs kind of what you're saying. People that say, "Wait, what, are we an empire or are we a republic?" I vote for republic myself. I don't like this idea of being an empire. it links us way too much to things that we don't want to be associated with. So yeah, I like to see myself become more grounded within the republic, like Hawaii was, should become a state. Ultimately, that's what I like. But the status of this ultimately is dependent upon politics, right? Certain parties will favor one territory over another, thinking that the composition of the people who live there are more likely to be predisposed to support their party versus the other, changing the composition of the Senate, changing the composition of the House for national politics. So it's always politics.
And speaking of Hawaii, there is a separatist movement there too among some of the native populations, but, you know, I can't see that being successful, but you know, it's under the surface, you know. And just think, one last thought, just think how young of a country we are. We've talked about this. I run into people from Europe, from the Middle East. They can't believe we're such a young country. Even if you include our colonial period and the pre-Columbian peoples are part of that, certainly, but as a formal nation, we're less than 250 years old. So we may be at a new stage where at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. We're just getting started. Who knows
Yeah,
that's
Churchillian
really-
idea.
We just don't know yet, right? We don't
Right.
have, so other scholars have mentioned that we look farther down the line, you know.
That's a good point. I mean, we think that this is nations are like organisms. They're not static, or I should say systems of organisms. They die, their birth, their rebirth. They
Done it
adapt.
before. We've done it before in our history, but we're just getting
Yeah.
started.
And I always like to say, that's a great point. If you think about pre-Civil War, if you look at America in 1840 and you look at America in 1880, I mean, we see it as the same country, but people living in 1840 would say, what? What do you mean? I mean, the country just fundamentally flipped, and so...
And the frontier closed in 1890. I mean, Jefferson thought the frontier wouldn't close
Yeah.
for centuries.
Yeah.
It did it, what, 90 years?
Yeah, he thought it would take how many generations, like 40 generations to fill up the West, and to make the West really part of the American sphere. We did it in less than 3 and 2. And so, yeah, we always talk about the arc of history. We think we know where things are going. That's a very, very dangerous thing to assume. We just don't know. We just don't know where. So we have to be humble in our prescriptions and try to find the best option. And the best option is, hey, we've got a good Constitution here. Let's hang on to it. Let's find ways of compromising. That's what it's all about. Shelby Foote, the great Civil War historian, he talked about that Americans are the great compromisers. Our whole government is based upon. And the one instance in which we failed to compromise was the Civil War, the fratricidal conflict of the mid-19th century that tore the country apart. But then out of it came something new, because although we did have to resort to arms, we did fall back on the Constitution. You know, it's interesting, after the Civil War, not a single state, with the exception of Virginia, and that was politics, had its borders changed. All the states were readmitted. As Lincoln said, I want you readmitted under quickest, most practicable terms. And they were. You could even make war on the United States and still have your state maintained. So that's just something to think about, how strong the Constitution was able to bring them back in. It didn't fix all the problems, but it did begin the process of reuniting the country.
We might still be in our late teenage years. We're not kind of middle age.
We're
Compared to
adolescents.
Europe, we're still adolescents, so, yeah, a little bit older.
Well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Great program.
Sign up, get signed, thank you. All right. Thanks, Dr. Mason.
Have a great day, guys.